everybody, it's Drybear. We did it. We finished our 5th class for theory crafting, leveling builds, and exploring all the mechanics across all the classes in Path of Exile 2 Early Access, which is the Sorceress. So today I'm going to do a review of everything we learned and experimented with on Sorceress to summarize it all up. Now, I think a lot of people saw this coming, but overall I would say that the Sorceress is definitely one of the most well-made, well-rounded, and most powerful classes currently in Early Access. And this is for many reasons, based on what's available in the skill tree, the value of their ascendancies, and the abilities overall. And I actually would personally say that the Sorceress in general is kind of like a target that I would use as a benchmark that the other classes should try to catch up to as far as their like early level offerings for what they can choose. I would say that basically everything in the first 3 rows is a viable option for a build direction for Sorceress to get started in the game and do the campaign, except for one skill, which is Ice Nova. I think Ice Nova is the only disappointing ability, and even going all the way down to the bottom here, most of these are all very useful and good for what they do. The bottom line as well, super strong. You can add a lot of different things to this, and I think overall this is one of the most well-rounded and balanced skill gem offering sheets of all the ones that are in the game. So I think Sorceress should be kind of like a learning mark for every other class as they look to make adjustments and things. Not to say that the other classes don't have more, right? We've done 5 out of 6 classes. We're starting on the Ranger, which means we're looking at the bow skills and bow, but we've already done, 4 builds for the Witch through all of their mechanics and both their ascendancies. We've done the same thing for Mace on both warrior ascendancies, the same thing for crossbow on mercenary, the same thing for the monk as well. We put all of those together to kind of fit things in one piece, and I think that this one is probably just the most well-rounded. The weirdest row is probably the elemental resist row. It does feel a little more confined, but because all the other rows are so well balanced and well made, that I think it just gives you a nice way to deal with single element builds that are running up against high resistance. But even then, you still have options in the skill tree as well to help balance that further. And from that standpoint, I think that there's, even though we're missing Templar and Druid adjacent here to the left on the skill tree, and we are missing Shadow here as well, I think that the Witch Sorceress skill tree offerings are probably among the best of the ones that you have around. I think Monk is also very well balanced. You can see just the sheer plethora of choices you have to start out with here and where you can go as well. You have some early penetration early on. You can go into Mana Shield or Mana Regeneration. There's also some power nodes immediately right outside, like next door, that can give you some strength early on. There's also a very easy way to get crit and then even go into further crit when you're going into the Monk area. There's plenty of ways to add in some supplementals early on, like Mana Regeneration or cast speed here as well. You can even go into chaos damage if you wanted to. There's more crit here, and even though it shares a location like the pizza slice on the skill tree with the Witch, they're not forced into taking Witch options. And I'm very curious that once we start getting doubled up classes, I'm hoping that continues to be the case, that when you get Huntress in here, you don't get too many projectile things or things that focus on range damage. When you get Duelist in here, there are options for dual wielding and one-handed weapons and two-handed weapons, which could be useful, but hopefully that balance stays. Same thing for Marauder, and then when we get Templar Druid, all of those I think should be balanced as effectively as well. And also just the ascendancies in general feel pretty well balanced. Chronomancer is an interesting one that does feel like it's lacking a little bit of a home, but maybe when we start getting more cooldown skills in the game, it starts to make more sense. And even then, just being able to freeze like a global room-wide stun, even though it does have harsh diminishing returns, is really strong, and be able to roll back your energy shield, mana, and HP, especially with combinations like going up here for Mind Over Matter, gives you a really flexible offering choice for the Sorceress. And in fact, I would say the Sorceress area is so good, there's even, Invoker builds that are benefiting greatly from the offerings here, because you can start Invoker and you come straight up here and you can get like lightning options, cold options, lightning. There's some fire here as well, and they're so good and strong for what you do that everything kind of comes together in a really, really satisfying way. So if I was comparing this to, our Monk review, our Mercenary review, our Warrior review, or our Witch review, I think the Sorceress is generally in a good spot, and I hope they use the Sorceress as kind of like a target point not thematically, but just generally as a game design package, that as they look at the other classes, the ones that may be needing more, if you look at the wealth of options here for the Sorceress, it fits the theme of the character, the class fantasy lines up, and it is able to build things together. But if you look at some of the more other options, honestly, even just in like the first 3 or 4 rows, we know that Bone Shatter is incredibly strong. Bone Shatter is probably the single ability that's carrying warriors through their leveling process more than any other. On most of the builds that actually just make it through leveling, even in the first 5 rows, just rely on Bone Shatter as ability to kill. Otherwise, like Earthquake is very underwhelming. You know, Shockwave Totem can be good if you build into it. Infernal Cry has a base high cooldown, which makes it hard to level with sometimes. They did a nice job with Resonating Shield buff. Shield Charge can be good as well. Armor Breaker feels like it's more of a Marauder duelist ability, sitting and masquerading as a mace. And there's definitely some challenges there. We have some other things going on with the crossbow, right? I think that the Permafrost bolts combined with the fragmentation rounds is a strong combination, but it doesn't really have that same kind of oomph. However, when it comes to the Sorceress tree, you don't really have that. Spark is an incredible ability that scales very well. It gives you Ricochet, it gives you Pierce by default, good damage scaling on top of it. Frostbomb also has high base, like insane base damage, but also has a CC element on top of it, which most classes can't boast about. Flame Wall not only does good damage over time by itself, but it also modifies any projectile skill that goes through it, which gives you tons of options and variety when you play along with it. Frostbolt is a little bit on the weaker side for leveling. It can be great late game and does have some synergies with Cold Snap and Ice Nova, but in general it does apply chill and does have a large amount of CC applied to it as well. Amber Fusillade, great for single target, and you have options from the support gems that allow you to modify how many projectiles you store up, how quickly you store them up, and there's scaling options here with like cast speed as well. Like if you do cast speed here or like cast speed here, I think there's a lot of really cool choices that make that come alive in a lot of ways as well. So I'm really excited just generally like where Sorceress is, and I only have good things to say for the most part on where it sits. However, the only thing that stands out to me, especially like even just in this whole page, the only ability that I was just honestly underwhelmed by and just disappointed in was Ice Nova. I think Ice Nova kind of struggles to find a home. Now, you can use this in other builds for super late game. Once you start including uniques and you want to do more cast on freeze and things like that, or you want to convert, you know, fire into ice, you know, cold damage and things like that, there's other things you could do. But in general, it never really felt like there was a reason to cast Ice Nova. Don't get me wrong, you could shoot the Frostbolt out and you can cast Ice Nova on it from a distance safely. It just felt like it didn't have as much cold or freeze buildup as some of the other options that you would use anyways. It didn't have the damage scaling that other abilities had. It was kind of slow to cast, and it just felt like I've tried to put Ice Nova in many builds, Invoker builds, into Sorceress builds, focus on cold or multi-element, and every single time I have put Ice Nova into a build, I ended up taking it out before I shipped it, just because it didn't really serve any purpose. It wasn't doing anything. It was just taking up a slot, taking up casting global animations and you know, using up your mana without any value being returned. And in general, I actually really like where the casters currently are when it comes to the support gems. Now, there's definitely some really cool options on both sides, right? On one side, you have things like Unleash, which gives you multiple casts on one spell, which is really good. And you have things like Arcane Tempo, which can give you a lot of value and speed on top of that, which is like the equivalent of like Martial Tempo, you know, Arcane Tempo, things like that. Gives you more speed overall. And you also have the ability to modify projectiles normally like other ones can. You can, you know, deal with ways to make them bigger or, you know, create Fortress. I think Fortress and Flame Wall is the most classic combination ever. And even things like Fast Forward and all of those work just as well as they do on other classes. And that gives you a good, valuable setup. You're not really, you know, encouraged as much to go into minions with the Sorceress, though you definitely can. If you wanted to, there's plenty of options for going into minion here or like minion here or going further up if you wanted, which I think takes more advantage of that in general. And I would like to see some crossover, maybe once we get the third ascendancy for Witch and Sorceress, but I think that there's enough there to really play around with it. And they also, even some of the things that feel like they're mostly martial focused, like for the martial, like weapon-based classes, that just work great on Sorceress in general. And I think also there's a massive increase of viability and options when you get to tier 2 support gems and tier 2 spirit gems that I feel like the martial classes could benefit from. Now, it's not like it's not there for the martial classes. Obviously, you can do things like once you get the frenzy on, like you actually get like combat frenzy activated here. That helps a lot of martial classes, especially ones that want power charges or frenzy charges. There needs to be an option here for endurance, I would like to see. But for casting in general, cast on shock, cast on minion death, cast on ignite, coming online during the campaign, and even getting cast on dodge, cast on critical, all of those are really cool. And again, I would love, 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 love to see some variants of this for martial coming in, but being able to simplify your build doing that is huge. And of course, we can't leave out the mega right now, which is Archmage for Sorceress. Just getting Archmage unlocked at level 58, like as you start your endgame mapping experience, just takes electric builds to the moon, especially for spell casting in general. You have Grim Feast, which is a great survival aspect. Arctic Armor is actually good as well. You get plenty of value from that too. I really like Mana Remnants for the mana on top of everything, and obviously being able to work in a non-class specific damage option outside of your character through a spirit gem is probably one of the most under talked about or like underrepresented boons that the casters like Sorceress and Witch have in general. SRS, Raging Spirits, makes a massive difference. Like imagine if there was a spirit gem that was, you know, not War Banner, but for martial classes, if they had the ability to summon totems or a way to kind of, you know, and maybe we'll get that once we get the Templar coming online, but being able to have this as an option has made some leveling builds for Sorceress just go that extra little bit if they were already like 80%, 90% there. Adding Raging Spirits, if they have any way to summon them, is massive and makes the build come together really nicely. The other thing that I think is probably also a big sleeper reason is why Sorceress feels so good is the offerings for wands and staves and focus. You don't really get this much variety when it comes to the other classes. Obviously Witch does too, but being able to freely move between staves and wands, and each one of them has their own ability, is actually a really big part of making Sorceress leveling feel really strong. So being able to have a Sigil of Power that you can use based on mana consummation, or you can put down things like you could do, don't destroy this, you can do Bone Blast for AoE on physical, you can get even power charges and stuff, and you can siphon mana, you can throw fireballs, like all of these things. I think having that option to go two-handed, one-handed freely. I don't think every class has this same variety. Like Quarterstaff is kind of locked in for Monk unless you're going pure chaos realistically. There's definitely some choices to be made on Warrior, whether you want to go two-handed, one-handed and shield, or two-handed and one hand with shield with Giant's Blood. But I think that the fact that each one of these offerings gives a different ability when you're leveling 1 to 65, gives you some nice ways to slot things in. And I think it would also just, again, be another learning point for some of the other classes to have that same kind of variety. I know you can get different elemental bonuses on Quivers for Ranger, or you can get some different bonuses on the different quarterstaves that you do. Slicing is super strong, getting barriers kind of cool for extra blocking on a Monk in general. And you can get, you know, some AoE crush for two-handed maces versus one-handed. But I feel like the variety is just so clean there for Sorceress overall that, you know, it's definitely been one of the best classes and most well-rounded to play so far. Now, that doesn't mean that Sorceress is without fault. There's definitely a bunch of fault within the class and how it's set up. And don't get me wrong, even though we do have some very strong builds combining things like Eternal Youth with Chaos Inoculation, with very high energy shield, or even converting straight into like Mind Over Matter to consume mana as part of your HP pool, there are some major problems when leveling with Sorceress that probably don't get talked about enough either, and that is just general survivability in multiple aspects. The first one that's worth talking about is going to be Stun Threshold. As far as Stun Threshold goes, there isn't a lot of really great options in the tree here. You can actually get Maximum Energy Shield as additional Stun Threshold, but only if you're going this way. There isn't really any option over here that feels really good. It's kind of like Energy Shield focus there. And without enough Stun Threshold, you actually get interrupted quite a lot for casting, which kind of makes the faster spells more favorable for the Sorceress versus others. You can obviously get some Stun Threshold here, but I think just having low Stun Threshold overall is a consideration that needs to be brought into the overall experience. Maybe even having some things like on this side that would come up. I don't know if it would be too much for these classes here. You could obviously go to the Templar Druid spot, but having low stun threshold is probably the #1 reason I would say why sorceress levels, especially if you're a new player, die during their leveling experience, is because you constantly get mini stunned, micro stunned, stunned, knocked back. Like all those things just get really, really annoying if you have low stun threshold. And it's also, I think, pushing some sorceresses to run with a wand in one hand and a shield in the other. I would also say that without good gear or a strong understanding on how to scale energy shield properly, sorceress is probably one of the squishiest leveling classes in the game. And even though you get to end game and when you have all the right uniques stacked up and you have tons of energy shield with crazy regeneration and you're running CI or you're running Eternal Youth with good flasks and things like that, sorceress becomes one of the more survivable classes in the game until you have those online. But I would say by default, sorceresses are very, very squishy and die quite a lot if they don't end up killing the target very quickly while leveling. If I was going to look at this from a beginner's player standpoint, regardless of whatever meta has developed and what people are talking about, I would say that like sorceress probably has one of the highest death rates among new players in general, just because again, if you don't know how to manage your gear, you don't know how to reroll your armor, your gloves, boots, helm to get the right stats, or how to stack energy shield, you can very easily get very squishy. And also, I think a lot of veteran players aren't giving credence to the fact that energy shield is more of a skill-based mechanism than evasion or armor. Because if you are taking lots of tick damage from dots or ground effects and you're not allowing the energy shield to recharge and you're going for energy shield because everyone's telling you to go for energy shield, it can lead to some very awkward situations, especially in your Trial of Sekhmet and Trial of Chaos where there's things going on all the time. Not knowing how to manage your energy shield is a big reason why I think they're very squishy. Now, that being said, do I feel like that needs to change? Probably not. That might just be a learning curve for Sorceress. And again, once you know how to use the tools that Sorceress has and you're able to get a little bit of stun threshold in there and manage your energy shield, it can make a world of difference. And at endgame, like even just starting out in maps and pushing like T1 through T16 and pushing towards citadels and stuff, Sorceress is in a great spot, but their leveling experience is quite squishy relative to others unless you're already a very skilled or experienced player. So that's where my head is at with Sorceress. I feel like I just gushed over Sorceress for the last X amount of time just yapping on it, but I would say that after doing, full witch discovery through all of the builds, working through Monk, including Acolyte of Chayula and Chaos, working through the Mercenary, all of the builds, working through Warrior, all the builds, doing all their ascendancies, even with Chronomancer, it did feel like Sorceress was the most well-rounded and the most complete based on the offerings they had in their kit, the gear choices they have to make while leveling, and what's available in the skill tree overall. And I hope that that same kind of perspective gets applied to others. Because I think that even just looking at the availability of the tree, I think there's still some glaring weaknesses. Like for Warrior, there isn't really any options for getting mana back other than converting HP to mana. There's definitely some major downsides here for survivability on Mercenary. I feel like Ranger has better choices than Mercenary or than Warrior, just because you can go down into Mercenary for projectiles, you can go up into Monk for either physical or for elemental damage if you wanted to line up lightning and things like that. There's also great choices for health recovery, mana recovery, life flasks, mana flasks. I think all of that is really clean, but I hope that they kind of learn from this area and apply the same down here and here, just to really make things cool for these other guys that are rolling along. But let me know what you think about Sorceress. Those are my thoughts. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.